I mean extraordinarily good at random acts of giving. In fact, I was thinking about over the last several months, some of the things that we've been able to do as a church. And one of those things that came to my mind is that back in the summer, we had Children of the Nations here, and we said we have 170 children in Uganda who need sponsoring. And in 2 days' time, we sponsored all 170 of those kids because of your generosity in that moment. And then at the end of July and into August, we had a back to school drive, and we brought in thousands of dollars worth of school supplies and gift cards that we were able to help out students in need throughout the DFW area. It's because of those random acts of giving. And then even last week, I want to show you this picture. Last week, we had our annual Thanksgiving drive here, and we had so much food come in that it filled this pickup truck, and then it was lining the sidewalk, and then even more food came in throughout the week. And so what we see over and over again, what I've seen since we launched this campus, is that you are really awesome. I mean, really awesome at these random acts of giving. And when we ask for help, you always step up to the plate and you always respond to those asks. And it's amazing to me, and it makes me proud to be the pastor of this campus because we can step into those moments and we can help others out. But here's the thing, and why I think that this timing is so important, because the reality is this: we're coming into this season of the year where it's a season of giving. And I don't want us to get stuck in this mindset that thinking the rest of our lives that we're really good at being generous when actually we're really good at random acts of giving. Because when we understand generosity and being generous, it truly changes things. It is a life-changing experience. Last week, we talked about what does it mean to be generous. I gave you this definition of generosity. We said that generosity is this premeditated, calculated, designated emancipation of your personal finances. And so if you weren't here last week, what I said that meant is this: that generosity is premeditated. It means that you have a plan, that it's calculated, that you know the amount, and then that it's designated, you know where it's going to go. And then finally, what we have to understand is that it's this emancipation, that we are literally going to set it free. And we're not going to allow money to be the thing that consumes and controls us. And so really today, here's what I want to do. I want to dig into how do we find the financial freedom that we are looking for that can oftentimes seem to anchor us down negatively. Here's what I'll say up front before I go any further. Like some of you might be here today and you probably already tuned me out because you're like, you know what, we're on week 3 of generosity and giving, and I just can't wait till Christmas, and we talk about the baby and Jesus and all the cute stuff of Christmas, and it get back to something that's more interesting to me, and so you've tuned me out. Others of you might have walked in here today and you're like, you know what, maybe you walked in for the first time and you think to yourself, if this church asked me for my money, then I'm out. This is not the place for me. But I want you to understand that's not what this series is about. Like my goal today is not to guilt you into giving. It's not for you to have this sense that if you don't give, then we have to shut the doors and we can't meet it here at Eaton High School anymore. It's not to guilt you into giving because that it would mean that our kids wouldn't be able to have goldfish for a snack in Compass Kids anymore or anything like that. My goal in this message is not even to bribe you. Like, it's not like if you put $10 in the bucket today and then you pull the handle, there's like going to be a slot machine and God's going to bless you with $100. That's not the intent of this message. It's simply to help you understand how you can become generous, because when you grasp that, it's freeing in so many ways. And I made this promise last week. Really, it's the big idea of this series, that when you become generous, you'll actually give more, and when you give more, you'll save more money and you'll consume less. But I think we can take that one step further. We talked about Jesus made a promise. He said, not only do those things happen, but he also said this. He said, when you do those things, ultimately what happens is that you become happy. Now, there is an exception to this rule. Jesus addressed that. That is for the people who are hoarding their money. Like, it's the people who have more than they need, and they're holding on to it for some financial emergency, or if the stock market crashes again. And if that's you, I would say you have what I would call the Ebenezer Scrooge syndrome, or for my era, my generation, it's like DuckTales, Scrooge McDuck, swimming in the money kind of. That's your mindset, that your mentality. And you've got more than enough, but you just can't seem to let it go. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, then you need to pay attention to this. If you're not, Like, you get a pass on this. This is your lucky day. You could just tune me out here. This is optional for you, right? But you might want to listen because it might cause you some curiosity. Jesus said these words in Acts chapter 20, verse 35. We talked about it last week. He said this. He said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, I want you to understand what Jesus is saying there, because this word blessed is a word that we throw around all the time today. Like, we have hashtag blessed, and everybody's blessed about everything, and there's blessings upon blessings, right? And what does the word blessing really mean? What does it mean to be blessed? Because it's misused now today, and I think it's misunderstood. Like, I think that some of us might take that Jesus says it's more blessed to give than receive, and we would say, man, I feel so blessed now that I give, and I have more than I've ever had, and I'm so proud of myself because I was a blessing to somebody else. But what Jesus is really trying to say here is this, it's more blessed to give than receive. What he's saying is, happy is the person whose life is ordered around giving rather than receiving. Jesus' promise is that when you give, and when you give out of this spirit of generosity, he says, look, you'll be happy. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to be happy. I don't want to be miserable in life. But the problem is, when it comes to money and when it comes to our finances, the reality is this: a lot of us aren't very happy, are we? I mean, money is something that tends to bring us down because the bills come due every month, and you open the mailbox and you're like, man, I got to pay the electric bill again this month, and now it's getting colder out and it's going up, right? And so the bills come due and these things, and you don't really have much happiness when it comes to your money. Instead, what happens, I think, for a lot of us when it comes to our money is, rather than feeling content with what we have, we tend to worry. I'm guilty of this in my own life. You know, ever since Amanda and I started dating, even when we got married, when we went off to college, Amanda tells the story better, but she didn't have much money to her name, and so she thought the best thing that she could do, because she knew we were going to get married, was to put all of our money together, and that way she would have all of my money and the little bit of her money, and she could spend my money too. And so we went off to college, and I was in charge of handling the money. I've always been the one to pay all the bills and take care of all that stuff. Well, as I've shared before, my wife is probably one of the most generous people that I know. Now, for me, generosity has not always been something that's easy to do. Like I've always had a tendency to worry about how I'm going to pay for things, or where my money's going, or if I'm ever going to have enough. Well, Amanda, on the other hand, she never seems to worry about money. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that she never knows how much is actually in the bank account, right? But when she is spending money and she's giving money away all the time, it causes me to worry sometimes. But she's always been like, look, Nate, we've got more than enough. Like, we have more than we need, and we're gonna be able to help this person out, and it's gonna be worth it. And it's taken me a long time to get to that same point in my life. And you know why? Because I tend to worry about money. And maybe you can relate. Now here's the thing. When we allow worry to rule how we give or we spend our money, it begins to consume us negatively. And when that happens, what happens is we allow worry to take control of our lives. And you know what happens? We start to spend more than we make, and it starts this crazy cycle in our lives. And what happens is, when we spend more than we make, is that we're left with no margin. And when there's no margin, when there's no wiggle room, you know what we do? We figure out, how can I get more money? And so what do? We go out and we get a loan, because we have to have that brand new HD TV for the Super Bowl, because we got to see it in the highest definition of definition. Or we got to have the iPhone XS because we just got the iPhone X last year, but the technology's out of date. And so what do? We get a loan, and we go into more debt, and what happens is we dig ourselves into this hole, and we consume more than we can afford. Can I just say this? That cycle is crazy, but it's the reality for many Americans today. Now, here's why I say that, and here's why I want you to think about that question for a minute. Here's the question I want to ask you. How much money would it take for you to feel like you had enough? Enough to pay cash for everything? To pay off all the debt that you have, to buy a nice car, to pay off your home? How much money would that take? Would it be 10%, 15%, 20%, 25 more percent? If you got that kind of raise, would that be enough for you? What if you went into work tomorrow and they said, congratulations, you just got a 25% a year raise. Would that be enough for you? Do you know what the statistics say would happen if we got a 25% raise tomorrow? What would happen is we'd start spending that money too. And it's the crazy habits that we have. Another question I'll ask is this: how much money would it take for you to feel like you have created financial margin in your life? Would another 10% do it for you? If you had another 10%, would you start saving that money or would you spend it? The answer to that question is simply this: whatever your current habit is, it will continue as you get more raises, you make more money, because it's not a money problem. It's a discipline problem, and it's a discipline issue. Now, for those of us here today who are followers of Christ, for those of us who have already made that decision to make Jesus number one in your life, then I've got a question for you. If you're new, if you're just exploring this whole thing, you get a pass on this. But you're welcome to listen in. But here's what I would ask you. How much more money would you need to stop worrying about your money? You know, the answer is that if you worry about your money, there's a good chance that no matter how much money you make, you're going to continue to worry about your money, and it will consume and it will control you. You know, I remember when my family and I, we moved from Cincinnati, Ohio, to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania 6.5 years ago to serve at the church we were at before we moved to Texas last year. And when we moved there, both Amanda and I were working at the time at the church in Cincinnati. We were making really good money. We had just built a new home about 3.5 years before where we had picked out everything. We thought we were going to be there forever. And it was in the midst of the housing recession and collapse. And then we got called to Pennsylvania, and it meant that we were going to take a $30,000 a year pay cut because I was going to make more money, but my wife wasn't going to work. It also meant that we were going to try to sell our home at the end of the housing recession. So we built this house when the prices were skyrocketing high, and now we were going to try to sell when the recession was kind of ending. Well, our house didn't sell when we first moved to Pennsylvania, so that meant that we had to move into this in-law suite of some generous members of the church. When we finally sold our house 4.5 months after we moved to Pennsylvania, I had to write a check at closing of upwards of $30,000 just to get out of the mortgage that we were in. And so not only did I take a $30,000 a year pay cut, but I also wrote a check for $30,000. And when all that happened, I'll be honest with you, I allowed worry to consume me and our financial situation, even though I knew that this is where God wanted us to be. And maybe you can relate. Now here's the thing that I want you to hear today. Worry is not a money problem. Worry is a spiritual problem. Listen to these words that Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17. We looked at them real quickly last week, but Paul's writing to his protege Timothy, and he gives him this wise counsel. He says this: teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. And the problem is this, what Paul is saying here is this: we should put our trust in God, who gives us everything we need, but what happens, Paul says, is that we don't put our trust in God. We instead put our trust in the riches of this world rather than the richness of God. And when we do this, we have to understand that this is crazy. That this is financial craziness when we put our trust and our hope in the things of this world rather than the one who gives us everything. Now, here's the thing that I want to talk about with the rest of our time today. I want to talk about how do we start to get out of this crazy cycle that we tend to be in. And I really want to show you that there is a better way to live. That more money does not mean more discipline, and that more money does not mean more contentment in life. In fact, I want you to think about it this way. Does anybody here like to go to a buffet and eat? Or is it just me? All right. Well, especially when I was in high school, there was a time where I weighed about 300 pounds. I know it's hard to believe, but I weighed 300 pounds and I could eat. And whenever we went to a buffet, I loved it because that meant I could eat as much as I wanted. And I was leaving that place, they were paying me money, right, to get out of there because I was eating them out of food. Well, whenever you go to a buffet, you know, you go up, you get the plate, and you put what you want on it. And if your thinking is like mine, you're not just eating one plate at a buffet, right? You're going to go back, because if you only ate one plate, then you didn't eat enough for what you paid for. So you go back and you eat plate number 2. And if you're me, I'd go back and eat plate number 3. And about plate 3, that's when I'm starting to get content. And I know if I eat pretty much any more than that, I'm not going to be content anymore. But it was always in that moment that I realized, shoot, I didn't go to the dessert bar yet, right? And you cannot go to a buffet and not eat the dessert too, because you paid for it. And so my mindset was, let's go to the dessert bar and I'll just pick one. So I get over to the dessert bar, and there's always 15 different selections and like 3 different pies that I like. And so what do? I start putting a little piece of everything that I like on there. And so I walk back and I've got 3 different desserts on my plate, and I eat the first one, and then I eat the second one. And then by the time I get to the third one, I'm feeling miserable, and now I'm discontent, and I need somebody to push me out of the restaurant in a wheelchair. You know what I'm talking about? Like we've all probably been there. You're probably going to do it this next week with Thanksgiving. All that food's going to be on the table, and you're going to pass it around once, and then you're going to pass it around twice, and you're going to be like, man, I shouldn't eat anymore, but it's so good. And then somebody's going to go, don't forget about the pumpkin pie with the whipped cream on top, right? And what you're going to do, you're going to eat it, and you're going to feel discontent. And the same is true with money. Like we said last week, what we have to understand is that here in America, we are so rich. Like if a third world country, someone from a third world country were to come here, they would look at our lives and they'd hear us complain about all the things that we don't have, and they would say, you are crazy because you're rich. But being rich to us, it never seems as though we have enough. And so even though we're rich, we never seem content. And here's what we have to understand, that having more money does not give us the contentment that we are looking for. That more money won't eliminate worry in our lives, because worry is way more than money problems. And that's what truly generous people understand. They're not driven by money in this way. They're not driven by what I would call consumption assumption, which is this idea that if it comes to me, then it's for me. You see, this is a mindset thing that we've got to get out of, and we can't think this way. In fact, Jesus addresses this issue many times in Scripture, but he would say if we have that mindset of consumption assumption, really what that is that we have greed in our lives. And understand what that means. Greed is the person who has very little. Greed is the person who has just enough. Greed is the person who has way more than they need and assumes that it all belongs to them. You know, it reminds me of the scene from National Lampoon's Vegas Vacation. There's an older gentleman that's sitting in the casino, and he's sitting there and he's got this ticket in his hand, and he begins to check off the numbers, and they're calling out the numbers, and he realizes that he's just won all the money, that he's been waiting his whole life for this. And when he wins the money, he gets really excited, and take a look what happens next. Watch this.
I won. Yeah, I won. All the years I've waited for this, years. I've been coming here for years. I never won once, and now I won. The money is mine. I have the money. The money is mine. I got it for the first time. I got the money.
Hey, sir? Are you all right?
Go get someone.
Sir?
Now that's a humorous way to portray it, but this is what happens when we think of the money as all ours. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. But what happens is our financial worry, the tension, the grief that we experience, it's all simply because we can't get what we want. And this is the crazy cycle that we tend to live in. But here's what I want you to hear today. This doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you if this is the cycle that you're in right now. It's just what happens when we live according to the patterns of this world and the crazy cycle that is driven by worry. And every single time when we allow worry to be the thing that consumes us, that leads to discontentment in our life. But the good news is that you can break that cycle in your life by learning to truly be generous. When we learn to be generous, what happens is We crush the consumption assumption that oftentimes lives in our lives. And next week, I want to give you the plan for that. How do you crush this in your life? But today, before we can even get to that point, I want to give you a week to really think about how do you do that. And so really what we have to understand is that it's a mental thing. It's a different way of thinking, which is how I want to wrap up this message today. And here's the takeaway that I think you need to learn before we move forward next week, and that's this. It's not about my consumption. If it comes to me, it's not necessarily for me. In fact, I would encourage you to write that down somewhere and maybe put that as a note that sits on your dashboard so you remember that this week. That this is how we have to start thinking, that it's not about my consumption. If it comes to me, it's not necessarily for me. This is something that Jesus taught in a parable one day when he was walking along the road with his disciples. It's in the Gospel of Luke. Luke is the gospel recording of Jesus' life, and Luke was one of Jesus' disciples. And he says that one day, Jesus tells them this story, and we read about it in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 to 21. Listen to what it says. It says, "And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God.'" Now Jesus, he tells this story of a guy who has gotten a better harvest than he's ever had before. He has more crops than he's ever had before. And I imagine that this guy is kind of like the guy in the clip that we just saw. He's like, "I won the money. I won the money. The money's all mine. It's all mine. I won the money." And Jesus says that this guy, he literally decides that the best thing that he can do with all of the crops that he's gotten is to store up everything for himself into bigger barns. But then notice what God says to him next in verse 20. It says, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" Like in this moment, God's like, "Hello, McFly. Like, why do you think this is even a good idea? Like, why do you think that storing up for yourselves is good? Because don't you realize that on this very night, your life is going to be demanded of you, and then who's going to get everything that you've stored up for yourself?" And we know who the answer to that is, right? Somebody else is getting it all. And it's not because this guy is generous. It's because why? This guy's dead, right? He's dead as a doornail. And everything that he saved up to consume himself, someone else is going to consume. Then notice how Jesus finishes up here in verse 21. He says, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." This is Jesus talking to us here. He's getting real with us. Like he wants us to understand that this can definitely be our reality too if we aren't careful. Jesus is saying, stop worrying about trying to store up more and more stuff for yourself and miss out on being truly rich towards God. And the moral of this story is this is what Jesus wants us to hear, is that fools, they spend their time storing up earthly wealth, but they neglect to have a rich relationship with God. And look, if you want to be rich towards God, then what we have to understand is that we have got to be generous. It means that we don't store it up for ourselves, but instead we have to be willing to give it away. Generous people don't assume that what they have is theirs. Generous people have a different mindset. Instead of seeing themselves as owners, they see themselves as managers. And you see, when that is our mindset, what happens is that we realize everything that we have has been given to us by God anyway, and we realize that at any moment it could be taken away from us. You know, as I shared a little bit earlier, when Amanda and I moved to Pennsylvania 6.5 years ago, our home in Cincinnati hadn't sold, and so we just moved to Pennsylvania with just a few possessions that we could pack in to our 2 cars and a little cargo van that my dad had brought from Ohio. And we ended up living in a 400 square foot in-law suite of these people of the church there. And when our home finally sold, we didn't even have enough money to close on the sale of the house. So we had to start selling all of the items that we actually owned in our house. We sold most of our furniture to the lady who ended up buying our house from us. And so when we wrote the check at closing, we literally had $400 left to our name, with no money and no home in Pennsylvania and nowhere else to go. What we ended up doing is living with this generous family for the next year in that 400 square foot space. And then all of the stuff that we did move to Pennsylvania when our house finally sold, we packed up, we put it in a storage unit, and it lived in that storage unit for about 5 months. We lived with the bare necessities. But I would say this, during that time, it was probably one of the most content times we've ever had in our marriage. I think one of the reasons was because of something that Gary, who we lived with, said to us one night when we were sitting around the table, realizing we didn't really have anywhere to go. We were broke. We didn't know what we were going to do. We thought we were going to end up living with them forever because we were never going to be able to get out of it. And he was sitting at the table, and I remember very vividly, Amanda's sitting at the table, and she's crying, and she's like, what are we going to do? We don't have any money. We can't go anywhere, and all of our stuff, we just sold it. And Gary's words, and he always tried to bring some levity in those situations. He said, listen, you have to understand, it's all going to burn anyway. And when he said that, Zina, his wife, was like, Gary, that is so insensitive. You shouldn't do that. But we just started to burst out in laughter because we realized that was exactly what we needed to hear. You see, at some point, all the stuff that we have to realize that we can't take it with us anyway. And so, if knowing that, what if that's how we applied our living to our lives? That rather than acting like owners, we thought of ourselves more like the managers we're called to be of what God has given us. That rather than spending, we started giving and being more generous. Can you imagine what might happen? What if we started to act a little bit crazy and got crazy generous like Jesus has called us to be? Can you imagine what could happen? What would happen is this. If we truly became crazy generous, we would become crazy rich. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to be rich. Like, I want to be rich, but I want to be rich in the right kind of way, and my guess is that you do too. And the kind of rich that we get to be is rich towards God if we are truly generous. And so let me challenge you with this today. Look, if you're going to put your hope in God at the end, what do you need to do today to put your hope in God in the middle? Like if you're going to trust God in the end, if you know, like, I know where I'm spending eternity, I know where I'm going, I know that heaven is the place that I'm going to be with God, then what do you need to do right now to put your hope in Him? Maybe it's to start being generous with what you have for the first time. Maybe it's to let go of something that you've been holding on to because you realize that you can't take it with you. Do you have something that you could let go of that would allow you to be crazy generous and give back to God who has blessed you with so much? The other day when I wrote that and I was reading back over this, I thought to myself, shoot, I got some stuff that I need to let go of. And my wife's going to be happy that I'm even saying this. I got some autographed baseballs that I probably should let go of because they sit there and collect dust. And I could be rich towards God with those things. You know, over the last 2 months, we've been every week showing videos of the things that God's been doing through the generosity of many, through the Uncharted initiative. And each week you've seen different things that we've done, helping here locally and globally and all around the world. We've just been able to do so many things because of the generosity of so many. You know, the reason that Compass North Fort Worth exists today is because there was a group of people who were crazy enough in both Colleyville and Roanoke to say, we want to do something crazy in 2018. And so what did they do? They decided to not just launch one campus, they decided to launch 2 campuses. That's why Compass North Richland Hills exists today, and that's why Compass North Fort Worth exists today. But they didn't stop being crazy. As I was thinking about this, they've been even crazier. You see, this space that we're sitting in today in our Compass Kids space, it was all paid for with cash. All the equipment here is paid for. The trailers that we drive, the truck that we drive, it was paid for with cash. Over $300,000 was invested in this campus just to get it off the ground. But that wasn't the extent of the craziness. You know, I was thinking about the other things that they've done over the last several months. Even before we launched this campus, they put a contract on a piece of land. They didn't know how it was going to go. And they said, you know what? We're going to go ahead and buy 15.5 acres and we're going to plan for the future. And then the week after we launched, you know what's even crazier? They paid for that land and now we own that land. So now we can talk about building a building in the next year over across 287 there. And they were crazy. You know why they did it? Because they were crazy about people and they were crazy generous, and we need to be the same way. Because here's what I believe. I believe that God is just getting started here. And the best is still yet to come. I know in my mind that what God has already done is more than we could have even imagined maybe in our minds. But God's got even better things planned, and I cannot wait to see what he's going to do. And so I'm going to be a little bit crazy. And I want you to challenge you to be crazy too, because you'd be crazy not to join him. And so next week, I want you to come back because we're going to continue this series. And we're going to look at what does it look like to live out this crazy, generous plan in our lives. I want to give you that plan and how to live that out in your life, because when you apply that, it changes things. It changes things in the best of ways, and you become crazy generous the way that Jesus calls us to. So come back next week, because next week, I'm going to also share a little bit of my heart of where I believe that God's leading us to, and you don't want to miss it. So I just want to pray for us as we close out today.